Good morning. Today is Friday, July 31st in the year 2020, and we are going to continue our look at Thinking About God by Fisher Humphreys. Today we are in chapter 5, and we're going to deal with the title of this chapter is Jesus Christ, but the title of the next chapter is The Work of Christ. So you can think of this one more as the person of Jesus Christ. Now, we can begin with a very straightforward assertion. Jesus Christ is probably the most famous person who ever lived. Even non-Christians deal with Jesus in one way or another. Many Muslims consider him a prophet. Some Jews do as well. Even some Buddhists and Hindus consider him to be a holy man. Not all of them, of course, but some. And all of them have to deal with him in some way. So, today we're going to talk about mainly two things and what follows after them. Okay? Those two things are Jesus is human and Jesus is divine. And then the unity of those two components. And some misunderstandings along the way. We're going to start with discussing the deity of Christ. We know that the first Christians were Jewish men and women, and that even we have Peter in Mark, which is probably the oldest gospel, asserting that Jesus is the anointed one, the Messiah, the Christos in Greek. But I also think that it is fair to say he didn't know what he meant by that. Or rather, he meant something, but he did not fully understand it. But that's consistent with the Gospels and even with Acts. But this misunderstanding persisted, I think, up to Jesus' death and then to his resurrection. And it is the resurrection that is a key component in understanding the divinity of Christ. When people discuss the resurrection, they make one of two, if not both, claims. The first claim is to defend the historicity of the resurrection, that it was a historical event, a bodily resurrection. And the second is to defend the spiritual truth of the resurrection, whether it was a historical event or not. I, and as Fisher says, have sympathy for both of them. I think there is some validity in the spiritual understanding, but I also think there's a great deal of historical evidence for the bodily resurrection of Christ. I believe in the bodily resurrection of Christ. I just don't think that the spiritual understanding of it is wrong as long as it doesn't deny the bodily resurrection part. It is important that we assert the bodily resurrection of Christ because through that we can assert four things. First, the resurrection means that Jesus is alive, that he continues, that Jesus was alive as Mary's child, and that Jesus is alive now. Jesus was not simply a historical person, he is a present person. Second, it means the resurrection of Jesus means that he is vindicated, that he is proven to be true in what he said and what he asserted about himself and the world. The resurrection is, in some ways, a stamp of approval. In particular, it is a stamp of approval on his ability to forgive sins. Third, the resurrection of Christ means that Christians also have hope of a resurrection, of a life that continues. And ultimately, fourth, this means that Jesus is God. Jesus was raised from the dead, never to die again. Others have been raised from the dead, but eventually they do die. Jesus' resurrection was forever. The resurrection of Christ brings the church into being. It makes Christianity possible. Now, there's a lot of depth here. We move now to the writer of Hebrews, who made certain assertions about Jesus because of his resurrection. You can find Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. This is the New Revised Standard Version. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he created all things. There are a lot of assertions here in this passage. First, that Jesus is superior to the prophets. In fact, much of the book of Hebrews is an assertion of Jesus' superiority to various sources of authority, of things that people might rely on for their understanding of God or the world. The writer of Hebrews asserts Jesus is superior. Second, it describes Jesus as God's Son. There are those who argue that the assertion that Jesus is the Son of God came later, but the book of Hebrews, probably mid to late first century, this is an early attestation that Christians believed Jesus was the Son of God. Third, the writer presupposes Jesus's pre-existence. What I mean by that is that Jesus did not begin his existence as Mary's child. Or perhaps we should say the Christ did not begin his existence as Mary's child. He does this in two ways. He says that, well, he does this mainly by saying, in these last days, these most recent days, he existed before, and that he created the worlds through him. Jesus is the agent of creation. Is testified in several places in Scripture, but here we think of it as Jesus's pre-existence, that Jesus was not something new that came along. This is important to our understanding of Christ, that we do not believe in adoptionism. We'll talk about some of these radical beliefs in a few minutes, but it was not that there was a man called Jesus and God said, oh, I adopt him as my son. It wasn't that the Son of God was a new thing created in the world, but rather Jesus the Christ, the Son, um, different ways we could talk about him. He existed before creation. That, really, to me, above all else, is a very firm attestation of the divinity of Christ. We want to move now into talking about Jesus' humanity. The gospel writers are clear to make Jesus human. Even those that do not contain birth narratives, like Mark and John. In John, we see a Jesus that is very divine. I mean, that's really John's point is that Jesus is the Son of God. Nevertheless, we still have Jesus as a real human being. Jesus who takes naps. Jesus who eats food. Jesus who deals with opposition. Jesus who displays anger and love and compassion. Again, going back to Hebrews, we say that we have a high priest who was in all ways tempted as we are. That Jesus faced and dealt with temptations as a human being. It is these two claims together that set Jesus apart. Jesus' divinity and Jesus' humanity. It is both of those things that make our understanding of Christ what it is. But that has also been the source of most of our misunderstandings and problems in Christian theology, is anything that asserts less than the co-divinity and humanity of Jesus has led to problems. And it has led to a variety of problems. Some of it comes from our simple inability to hold this concept in our head. Some of us, it comes from a lack of understanding, or rather a lack of proper terminology. In one of the earliest, we're just going to talk about a few of these heresies. One is Nestorianism. A simple way to describe Nestorianism is simply that Jesus had two distinct personalities. That he was human and divine, but the two were not mixed. That sometimes he acted from his human self and sometimes he acted from his divine self. The church condemned that in 431. A little later, we had the development of Arianism. Excuse me. Arius denied Jesus's full divinity. He didn't like didn't really like that idea of the divine suffering. And this has gone on throughout history. When we misunderstand the dual nature of Christ, and that there is a union between those two natures, we misunderstand Christ. Fisher concludes this chapter with some modern understandings of Christ, but he closes with an observation that he says, I close with one observation. The more deeply we think about Jesus, the more we come to realize that the real challenge of Jesus is to our faith rather than to our minds alone. The question is not how much we understand, for we know a mystery always remains. The question is how much we trust the glorious God who loved us to invade our world as one of us in order to rescue us from our predicament. There's a reason we call ourselves Christians. Christ is our foundation and bedrock. His nature is a mystery, as has been stated, but it is also a profound gift to us that God would become one of us. And it is on that mystery we rely. Next week, since this is Friday, we will talk about the work of Christ from chapter 6. This is perhaps more and less understandable, but I do think that we can get in a little more detail next time. Until then, God bless you.